was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind of morning when the sun was soft and the air was filled with calmness. The shooting range at the edge of the small town was already alive with activity. A group of young shooters laughed loudly as they prepared their rifles, adjusting scopes, showing off their latest gear, and bragging about their accuracy. It was a place filled with noise, pride, and competition. Everyone there looked confident, dressed in fancy shooting jackets and expensive sunglasses. Among them, a small, fragile figure slowly made her way toward the entrance. It was an old woman, wearing a simple gray coat and holding a faded rifle case that looked as old as she was. Her name was Margaret Hale, though no one there knew it yet. Her steps were slow but steady, each one taken with quiet determination. The chatter around her began to fade as people noticed her. Heads turned. Some frowned, others smirked. She was clearly out of place among the young and bold crowd. One of the men whispered to his friend, "What's she doing here? Did she get lost?" His friend chuckled. "Maybe she's looking for her grandson," he joked. Laughter followed. Margaret heard it but didn't react. Her face stayed calm, her eyes gentle but sharp as if she was used to such looks. She clutched the handle of her rifle case a little tighter and continued walking toward the shooting lanes. Inside, the air was filled with the smell of gunpowder and metal. The sound of bullets hitting targets echoed in steady rhythm. Margaret took a seat at a wooden bench near the back. She placed her rifle case on the table and began to slowly unzip it. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from age and years of hard use. The shooters nearby watched with half-hidden amusement. Rick, a tall man in his early 30s, was the loudest of the bunch. He was known for his arrogance and for never missing a chance to show off. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You sure you're in the right place? The knitting club is 2 blocks down." The others burst into laughter again. Margaret didn't even look up. She continued to open her case, carefully lifting out an old, dusty rifle wrapped in a faded cloth. The moment she placed it on the table, a few eyebrows raised. It wasn't a fancy new rifle like the others used. It was an M24 sniper rifle, old but clean, the kind of weapon used decades ago. Rick smirked. "Wow, that thing belongs in a museum," he said. "You planning to shoot targets or memories?" His friends laughed again, but one of the range officers, a man named Tom, watched quietly from the corner. There was something about the old woman's calmness that caught his attention. Margaret adjusted her seat and took a long breath. Her movements were slow, graceful, and exact. She cleaned the barrel, adjusted the scope slightly, and checked the chamber. Every move was deliberate, as if she had done it thousands of times before. She didn't rush, didn't speak, and didn't seem bothered by the laughter around her. Meanwhile, Rick and his friends continued their banter. They took turns shooting at their targets, boasting loudly after every near-perfect shot. "You see that, boys?" Rick said after hitting the bullseye. "That's how it's done. Maybe Grandma should take notes before she breaks a hip." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes still on her rifle. She remembered days long ago. Dusty fields, desert heat, and the weight of a rifle much heavier than this one. She remembered the silence before a shot, the focus it demanded, and the calm that came after. Those were different times, darker times, but they had made her who she was. Tom, the range officer, finally approached her. "Ma'am, do you need any help setting up?" he asked politely. Margaret looked up and smiled kindly. "No, thank you, young man," she said in a soft but firm voice. "I've been setting up rifles longer than most of these boys have been alive." Her tone wasn't proud, it was simple truth. Tom blinked, a little surprised. There was strength in her voice, the kind that comes from experience, not arrogance. When she finally stood up and walked toward the shooting line, the room grew quieter. The sight was almost strange. A small gray-haired woman walking with a rifle in hand, her steps steady and confident. She chose the farthest lane, the one most shooters avoided because the target was at the maximum distance. Rick chuckled again. "Oh, she's going for the long shot. This I've got to see," he said, crossing his arms. The others gathered to watch, ready to enjoy the show. Margaret positioned herself carefully, adjusting the stand, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. She checked the wind flag, adjusted her scope once more, and slowly lowered herself into shooting position. Her breathing became steady, almost rhythmic. The air seemed to still around her. For a brief moment, the young shooters stopped laughing. There was something about her focus, something they couldn't explain. It was as if time had slowed down. The wrinkles on her face softened under the shadow of concentration. She was no longer just an old woman. She was something else, someone used to silence, precision, and pressure. Rick leaned to one of his friends and whispered, "Let's see if she even hits the board." But deep down, even he felt something different, a strange unease he couldn't name. Margaret's finger rested gently on the trigger. She wasn't thinking about the mockery anymore. Her world had shrunk to one small circle, the target. The sound of the range, the laughter, everything faded away. In that moment, she was back in the field years ago, with the same calm heartbeat and the same sure aim. No one knew it yet. But what would happen next would silence every arrogant voice in that room. Margaret had just taken her place at the shooting lane. The cool morning breeze slipped through the open windows of the range, brushing against her silver hair. She closed one eye, taking her time to align her rifle, her movements steady and practiced. But before she could even take her first shot, the laughter started again. Rick, the self-proclaimed best shooter of the group, leaned against a table nearby, his expensive rifle shining under the lights. "Careful there, Grandma," he called out, grinning. "That thing might kick harder than your old bones can handle." His friends burst into loud laughter, slapping their knees and recording videos on their phones. Margaret didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on her target, her breathing calm and even, but their words carried easily across the range. "Maybe she's here for target practice," another one joked. "Like practicing how to miss." More laughter. Tom, the range officer, frowned. "Hey, cut it out," he said quietly. But the young men didn't stop. Arrogance had already taken root, and the idea of being corrected by an old woman was too amusing for them to resist. Rick took a step closer to her lane, pretending to offer help. "Here, ma'am," he said mockingly. "Let me show you how the real shooters do it." He lifted his own rifle, fired a shot, and hit near the bullseye. The target beeped with a satisfying tone. "See that?" he said proudly. "Now that's accuracy. But don't worry, I'll go easy on you." The group laughed again. One of them whispered, "She probably hasn't fired a gun since black and white TV was new." Another added, "Maybe she thinks this is bingo night." Still, Margaret said nothing. Her silence, instead of calming them, seemed to annoy them even more. People who are full of pride often can't stand being ignored. Rick tilted his head, watching her set up. "You sure you know what you're doing, Grandma? That rifle looks like it belongs in a museum." Margaret's hands paused for just a second as she adjusted the scope. Then softly she said without looking up, "Maybe, but even museum pieces still work, if they're well cared for." The calm confidence in her voice caught Rick off guard. He blinked, unsure how to respond. His friends laughed awkwardly to fill the silence. "She's got jokes," one of them said. "Let's see if her aim is as good as her mouth." Margaret exhaled slowly. She wasn't angry. In fact, she had heard much worse in her lifetime. Years ago, she had faced real danger, real enemies and real loss. The arrogance of a few boys barely touched her heart. Still, she remembered what it felt like to be underestimated, and part of her wanted to remind them what true skill looked like. As she adjusted her position, a few other visitors at the range started to watch. They weren't part of Rick's group, but they noticed the tension building. The old woman's calmness had a strange power to it, something quietly commanding. Rick decided to turn it into a show. "All right, everyone," he said loudly, raising his voice so the whole range could hear. "Let's see if the lady can even hit the target. I bet she'll miss by a mile." A few people laughed, others stayed silent. Even Tom, standing at his post, felt a twinge of nervous curiosity. Something told him this wouldn't end the way Rick expected. Margaret steadied her rifle again. She took a deep breath, her hands no longer shaking. The world around her faded into silence. Her vision narrowed down to the distant circle at the end of the lane. It wasn't just a paper target to her. It was a challenge, a reminder of the countless times she had been underestimated before. "Ready when you are, Grandma," Rick shouted, and then bang. The shot echoed through the room, sharp and crisp. Everyone's heads turned toward the electronic scoreboard above the target. A small light blinked red, and then the result appeared in bold letters. Bullseye. 100% accuracy. For a moment, there was absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Rick's grin froze on his face. His friends blinked, confused. "Wait, did she?" one of them whispered. Margaret lowered her rifle gently, her expression calm, almost peaceful. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply checked her rifle and prepared for another shot as if nothing had happened. Rick tried to laugh it off. "Lucky shot," he said quickly, his voice louder than before, almost defensive. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." But the calm way she loaded her next round made his confidence falter. There was no hesitation in her hands, no sign of chance. The way she handled her weapon, controlled, deliberate, disciplined, spoke of years of training. "Let's see her do it again," Rick said, forcing a smirk. She didn't respond. She simply aimed again. Another deep breath. Another moment of silence. Bang! Another perfect bullseye. This time, the silence that followed was heavier. The laughter was gone. Even the other shooters, the ones who hadn't been part of the teasing, began whispering to each other. "Who is she?" one man asked quietly. "That's not beginner's luck." Rick took a step back, his bravado fading. What are the odds?" he muttered. Margaret slowly stood up and looked over her shoulder. Her eyes met his for the first time. They were steady, kind, but sharp as a blade. "Son," she said gently, "sometimes the loudest shooters hit the least. Try aiming with your heart, not your ego." Rick had no reply. For the first time that morning, he was speechless. Tom, watching from the side, finally realized who she reminded him of. He'd seen her picture years ago, an old news article about a retired U.S. Army sniper named Margaret Hale, a woman who had broken accuracy records and saved countless lives in the field, and suddenly everything made sense. But for now, the crowd only knew one thing. The old woman they mocked had just changed everything. The air inside the shooting range had changed. What was once filled with laughter and arrogant chatter now felt heavy with silence and awe. The young shooters who had mocked Margaret only minutes ago stood frozen in disbelief. The sound of her second perfect shot still echoed faintly in their ears. Margaret didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She had seen faces like theirs many times before. Faces that shifted from arrogance to confusion, from laughter to silence. She knew the moment pride met truth. Slowly, she placed her rifle down and reached for a small cloth from her bag. Every motion was gentle, unhurried. She began cleaning the rifle, her wrinkled hands moving with precision. Each gesture spoke of long years of experience. She wiped the barrel, checked the scope, adjusted the strap, all in complete silence. It wasn't just preparation. It was ritual. The others watched, still trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Rick, the loudest of the group, crossed his arms and forced a laugh. "All right, maybe she got lucky twice. Let's see if she can do it again." But his voice trembled slightly, betraying the doubt creeping in. Margaret didn't answer. She simply continued her routine. She took out a small box of bullets, each one polished and perfectly lined. They weren't the kind you could buy at the local shop. These were military-grade rounds, the kind used for precision missions. Tom, the range officer, noticed immediately. His heart skipped a beat. He walked over quietly, curiosity and respect mixing in his expression. "Ma'am," he said softly, "that's a beautiful piece of equipment. You handle it like a professional." Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes focused on the rifle. "You could say I've had some practice," she replied. Her tone was calm, almost kind, but there was a weight to her words, the kind that hinted at stories not easily told. She looked up for the first time in a while, her gaze scanning the targets at the far end of the range. The sunlight through the windows glinted off the metal edges of her scope. She adjusted it with care, her fingers tracing the dials as if they were old friends. In the background, Rick and his friends whispered among themselves. "Who is she?" one muttered. "No way, she's just some random old lady." Rick frowned, trying to hide his growing unease. "Maybe she was a cop or something," he said, his pride desperate for an explanation. But deep down, he felt a cold twist in his gut. Her calmness wasn't something you could fake. Margaret settled back into position. Her breathing was slow, steady, the kind of breathing you learn only after years of discipline. Her eyes locked on the target again. The entire room seemed to hold its breath with her. She whispered something under her breath, a quiet phrase no one could hear. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was a memory. Bang, another shot. Another bullseye. The digital scoreboard lit up once more. There was no question now. This wasn't luck. This was mastery. Tom stepped closer, his eyes wide. "That's 3 perfect shots in a row," he said quietly, almost to himself. From that distance. That's not just skill, that's record-breaking. Margaret lowered her rifle and nodded politely as if she'd just done something ordinary. The wind's steady today, she said simply. Rick's face had turned pale. He tried to smile but failed. His friends, once loud and confident, now stood behind him in awkward silence. They looked like boys who had just realized they weren't nearly as great as they thought. Margaret began preparing again, checking the scope, cleaning the lens, reloading the chamber. Every move she made was calm, quiet, and exact. She wasn't showing off. She was focused. It was clear she didn't shoot for attention. She shot because it was part of who she was. A few people in the crowd started filming. Whispers spread across the range. "She's incredible," someone said. "Did you see her grouping? That's military precision." Another added, "She's got to be ex-military and maybe even special forces." Tom finally couldn't hold his curiosity any longer. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "forgive me for asking, but did you serve?" Margaret's hands paused for a moment. She smiled gently, her eyes distant as if looking through time itself. "A long time ago," she said softly, "in places where missing wasn't an option." The answer hit Tom like a wave. He suddenly remembered the old newspaper articles he had seen years ago. A woman sniper named Margaret Hale, known for her unmatched accuracy during a mission that saved dozens of lives. The same name. The same calm eyes. Could it really be her? He didn't say anything out loud, but his heart raced. If it truly was her, then everyone in that room was standing before a living legend. Margaret finished adjusting her gear and took one final deep breath. She looked peaceful now, almost serene. For her, this wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering the skill, the patience, the balance between strength and silence. As she lifted her rifle again, the light from the window fell across her face, highlighting the calm determination in her eyes. The same eyes that had once stared through the scope in the middle of a battlefield. The same steady hands that had once made impossible shots to protect others. She aimed once more. The air was still. No laughter, no jokes, no arrogance, just respect and awe. When the next shot rang out, everyone flinched instinctively. The scoreboard blinked again and another perfect bullseye. 4 in a row. Margaret exhaled slowly, lowering her rifle. For her, it was simply another day of doing what she had always done best. But for everyone else, it was a moment they would never forget. The moment they realized that behind the wrinkles and quiet smiles of an old woman stood a legend who needed no applause, only silence to perform. The range had fallen completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade away. Everyone's eyes were on Margaret now, the old woman who had just done the impossible 3 times in a row. The arrogant smiles were gone, replaced by quiet disbelief. Rick stood stiffly near his lane, his pride stinging harder with each perfect shot she made. He clenched his jaw, trying to convince himself it was luck, but in his gut he knew better. This was skill, pure, unshakable skill. Margaret rested her rifle gently on the stand. Her face was calm, her breathing steady. To her, the noise, the crowd, the whispers, none of it existed anymore. All she saw was the distant target and the faint shimmer of heat in the air. The world narrowed down to that one small circle. She closed her eyes for a moment. Memories flickered through her mind like faded film, dusty deserts, wind in her ears, the echo of distant gunfire, and the heavy heartbeat before pulling the trigger. Those days were long gone, but the rhythm had never left her. Shooting wasn't just something she learned. It had become part of who she was. Tom, the range officer, stood nearby, unable to look away. His hands were resting on the counter, but his mind was racing. He'd seen countless shooters, beginners, professionals, even decorated officers, but none like her. There was something sacred in her stillness, something that made time pause. Margaret leaned forward again, adjusting the scope by a single click. The small sound seemed loud in the quiet room. She tilted her head slightly, watching how the sunlight shifted across the range. Every detail mattered. The wind direction, the weight of the rifle, the air density, even the faint tremor of her own heartbeat. Rick, trying to recover his confidence, smirked nervously. "Let's see if Grandma can do it one more time," he muttered. But his voice didn't carry the same arrogance as before. It was weaker now, uncertain. Margaret didn't respond. She was beyond the reach of words now. Her fingers brushed the trigger lightly, not with force but with familiarity, like greeting an old friend. Her left eye stayed open, her right pressed gently against the scope. Her breath slowed, syncing with her heartbeat. In that stillness, something changed. It was as if the air itself was waiting. Then, bang! The shot cracked through the silence like thunder. The recoil was sharp but controlled. The sound echoed against the walls and then faded, replaced by the faint electronic beep of the target monitor. Everyone looked up. The scoreboard blinked for a moment, then displayed perfect score, 100% accuracy. Gasps filled the room. One man dropped his ear protectors in shock. Another whispered, "No way." From that distance, Margaret lowered her rifle slowly, exhaling as though she had released not just a bullet but years of quiet restraint. She didn't smile, didn't cheer. She simply nodded once, and as if confirming to herself that she still had it. Rick stared at the scoreboard, speechless. His earlier confidence had vanished completely. He had spent years calling himself the best shot at the range, the young sniper as he liked to brag. But in front of this old woman, his talent looked like child's play. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but trembling with respect. "That was incredible," he said. "I've never seen anything like that in my life." Margaret turned her head slightly and gave him a small, kind smile. "It's just a matter of patience," she said softly. "The rifle listens to you if you listen to it first." Her words hung in the air, simple but profound. Rick's friends exchanged awkward glances. They didn't know what to say. For the first time, they felt something heavier than embarrassment. Shame. Tom walked closer, his curiosity now burning. "Ma'am," he asked carefully, "forgive me if I'm wrong, but were you in the military?" Margaret's eyes softened. For a moment, she seemed far away again. "Once," she said quietly. "A long time ago. Different world, different time." She began cleaning her rifle again, each motion deliberate, almost graceful. The young men around her stayed silent, watching in awe. The way she handled her weapon was not just skill. It was love, respect, and memory all wrapped together. Rick finally took a slow step forward. Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of arrogance. Margaret paused, looking up at him. "Just someone who learned that the loudest person in the room rarely knows the most," she said gently. Then she added, "And that real strength doesn't need to shout." Rick's eyes dropped to the floor. He had no reply. The weight of her words hit harder than any bullet could. The rest of the range had gathered near her lane now, whispering in awe. A few had already looked her up online, and within seconds the truth spread. One of them whispered loudly, "She's Margaret Hale, the sniper from the Gulf War. She set records. She's a legend." Rick's heart sank. He realized the woman he had mocked, the woman he called Grandma, was a war hero. A living legend. Margaret simply smiled faintly, as if the attention meant nothing to her. She picked up her rifle case, gently placed her weapon inside, and zipped it shut. "I didn't come here to prove anything," she said softly. "I just missed the sound of the shot." As she walked toward the exit, everyone stepped aside quietly. No one laughed. No one spoke. They just watched her. This small, gentle woman who had reminded them all that greatness doesn't always come dressed in youth or arrogance. Rick finally whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "I'll never forget this day." Margaret stopped at the door, turned her head slightly, and said with a warm smile, "Good. Maybe next time you'll let your aim do the talking." Then she walked out, leaving behind a silence so deep that even the air seemed to bow in respect. The silence that followed Margaret's departure was unlike any silence the shooting range had ever known. It wasn't the calm of peace, but it was the heavy quiet that comes when truth crushes pride. Every person in that room stood still, eyes wide, as if their minds were struggling to catch up with what they had just witnessed. Rick's rifle rested uselessly on the table. His hands, once steady with arrogance, now trembled slightly. He stared at the target board that still showed her perfect scores, blinking red in the distance. Not a single miss. Every bullet had landed exactly where she wanted it to. Clean, sharp, flawless. One of the younger shooters broke the silence first. "Did she really say her name was Margaret Hale?" he asked, his voice low. Tom, the range officer, didn't answer right away. He stood there, his face pale with realization. Slowly, he walked to his desk, opened his computer and typed in the name. A few seconds later, the screen filled with old black and white photos, newspaper clippings, and faded military records. When he turned the monitor toward the others, they gasped. There she was, Margaret Hale, dressed in a military uniform, a rifle slung across her shoulder, her eyes fierce and focused. The article headline read, "The Ghost Sniper of the Gulf, the Woman Who Never Missed." Rick stepped closer, his throat dry. "No way," he whispered. Tom scrolled down. "She served 20 years in the U.S. Army," he said quietly. "They called her the Ghost Sniper because no enemy ever saw her before it was too late. She broke records that no one else could match. 35 confirmed long-range targets. The longest shot on record at the time, 1,580 meters. The room was silent again. Rick's friends looked at each other in disbelief. "You're saying, that's her? The woman we were laughing at?" Tom nodded slowly. "That's her." Rick felt his stomach twist. The sound of their earlier laughter now echoed painfully in his head. He remembered every cruel word, every smug smile, and now each one felt like a slap to his own face. He had mocked not just an old woman, but a hero, a legend, someone who had spent her life protecting people who didn't even know her name. He sat down heavily, staring at the floor. "I called her Grandma," he murmured almost to himself. "I laughed at her rifle. Her hands." His voice cracked. "She could have wiped the floor with any of us." Tom placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, she didn't come here to prove you wrong," he said gently. "She came here because she loves what she does. That's what people like her do. They never stop being who they are, even when the world forgets them." One of the young women who had been filming on her phone whispered, "This video, it's going viral already. People are calling her a legend." She turned her screen toward them. Margaret's quiet figure was already spreading across the internet. The humble old woman who shocked a crowd of arrogant shooters. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't the shooting. It was her calmness, her grace, her silence, her smile. There was no anger in her face, no pride, just quiet mastery. She had walked into a place full of mockery and walked out leaving behind a lesson they would never forget. Rick stood up, still shaken. "I need to find her," he said suddenly. "I have to apologize." Tom nodded, understanding. "She lives nearby, I think. She used to come here years ago, before most of us even worked here. She trained young recruits once. Some say she taught half the snipers in this state." Rick's chest tightened with guilt and admiration all at once. He realized that what he had mistaken for weakness was actually the highest form of strength, humility. She didn't need to brag or demand respect. Her silence commanded it. He stepped outside into the sunlight, the world suddenly feeling quieter than before. The wind rustled the flags near the range, carrying with it the faint scent of gunpowder and dust. He imagined her walking down that road, small, steady, with that same calm grace. Inside, the others gathered around the computer, reading more about her. One article mentioned that Margaret had once saved an entire unit by taking out an enemy sniper from over a mile away, in high wind, with limited visibility. "They said her hands never shook," Tom read aloud. "Not once." Someone murmured, "That's impossible." Tom shook his head. "No, that's Margaret Hale." Hours later, when the crowd had left and the sun had begun to set, Tom walked out to lock up. On the counter, he noticed something small and metallic lying on the wood. He picked it up and smiled faintly. It was an empty shell casing, the last one she had fired that day. On its base, carved in tiny letters, were the words, "Calm hands never miss." Tom placed the casing in his pocket, knowing it wasn't just a souvenir, it was a reminder. By nightfall, the video of Margaret's shots had spread everywhere. Comments poured in from people around the world, soldiers, veterans, and ordinary folks alike. Words like respect, legend, and inspiration filled the screen. And somewhere in a small house on the edge of town, Margaret sat by her window, a cup of tea in her hand. She looked peaceful, almost nostalgic. On the wall behind her hung a faded photograph, a younger version of herself in uniform, smiling beside her old rifle. She didn't need fame or attention. She had already lived her story, but maybe, just maybe, the world remembering her again wasn't such a bad thing. She smiled softly to herself and whispered, "Guess they finally learned to aim." Outside, the evening wind carried the sound of her words, quiet, humble, and strong. The legend of the old woman sniper had just begun again. The next morning, the shooting range was quieter than usual. The usual noise and laughter, boasting and chatter was gone. Everyone who had been there the day before felt different now. The story of the old woman had spread far beyond those walls. News outlets were calling her the legendary sniper grandma. Videos of her perfect shots had gone viral overnight, with millions of views and comments filled with admiration. But for the people who had seen her in person, it wasn't just a story. It was something that had changed them. Especially Rick. He hadn't slept much that night. The image of Margaret's calm face and those perfect shots replayed in his head again and again. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her soft voice saying, "The loudest shooters hit the least." It echoed like a quiet truth he could no longer ignore. By sunrise, he had made up his mind. He went back to the shooting range, hoping she would return. When he arrived, the air was cool and still, and the sunlight glowed faintly on the distant targets. Tom was already there, cleaning up near the counter. Rick walked over. "Tom," he said quietly, "do you think she'll come back?" Tom looked up with a small smile. "She usually comes on Sundays. But if I were you, I'd set up and wait. People like her don't show up for applause, they show up for peace." Rick nodded. He found the same lane where Margaret had stood and began setting up his rifle. For the first time in a long time, he felt small, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him want to learn again. He checked his scope, his stance, his breathing, realizing how careless he had been before. About an hour later, the door opened. The familiar sound of slow footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. Margaret had arrived. She wore the same gray coat and carried the same worn-out rifle case. Rick turned immediately, his heart racing. "Ma'am?" he called out. "Wait, please." Margaret paused, her kind eyes meeting his. "Oh," she said softly. "You're the young man from yesterday?" He nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. "Yes, ma'am, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything I said. For laughing at you," she smiled gently. "You don't owe me an apology, son. You were just doing what most people do, judging what they see instead of what they don't understand." Rick lowered his head. "Still, I feel awful. You didn't deserve that." Margaret walked over to her usual bench, setting down her rifle case. "You know," she said as she began to unpack it, "when I was young, I met a man who laughed at me too. He told me war wasn't a place for women. He said my hands were too small to handle a rifle. I didn't argue. I just trained harder. One day, when the bullets were real and fear filled the air, that same man froze up, and I took the shot that saved his life." Rick looked at her in awe. She wasn't bragging. Her tone was calm, almost tender. After that day, she continued, "I learned something important. Skill doesn't need to shout. Real power doesn't humiliate others. It protects, it teaches, it uplifts." Rick swallowed hard. Her words hit deep. He thought about all the times he'd laughed at beginners, the times he'd shown off instead of helping others learn. "I was arrogant," he admitted quietly. "I thought being the best meant making others feel small." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Many do. But the best shooters, the best people, aren't the ones who hit the target fastest. They're the ones who stay calm when everyone else loses focus." She handed him a bullet from her box. "Here," she said. "Keep this." He turned it over in his hand. It was smooth and shiny with tiny engraved words near the base. "Respect the silence." Rick looked up, confused. "What does that mean?" Margaret smiled. "Silence is where focus lives. It's where strength hides. Learn to respect it and you'll never miss, not just in shooting, but in life." She turned to face the range and took her position once again. Her movements were the same as before, graceful, deliberate, patient. She aimed, breathed, and fired. Bang! The bullet struck dead center. Another perfect shot. Rick didn't cheer. He didn't need to. He just watched, learning more from her quiet presence than he'd learned from any teacher. Tom walked over from behind the counter, smiling. "Looks like you found your mentor," he said softly. Rick nodded. "Yeah," he whispered. "The best one I could ever ask for." Margaret packed her rifle back into its case. As she prepared to leave, Rick called out, "Will you come back next week?" She looked over her shoulder, smiling warmly. "Maybe. But whether I do or not, keep practicing, not just your aim, but your patience." And with that, she walked out again, the same calm steps echoing across the floor. Rick stood there for a long time after she left. He didn't shoot that morning. He just stood holding the bullet she had given him, staring at the words engraved on it. Respect the silence. From that day on, something inside him changed. He stopped showing off. He started helping the newcomers at the range. He taught them what Margaret had taught him. Not how to shoot faster, but how to breathe slower. Not how to aim higher, but how to stay calm when it mattered most. And every time someone asked him how he got so good, he'd smile quietly and say, "I learned from a legend, the kind who doesn't need applause to prove it. Some lessons are shouted. The greatest ones are whispered." Weeks passed, but the story of the old woman at the shooting range didn't fade. It grew. What started as a small video on someone's phone had become a symbol of humility and respect all over the internet. Millions watched in awe as Margaret Hale, the old woman sniper, calmly hit every bullseye while surrounded by laughter and mockery. People didn't just see a shooter, they saw something deeper. They saw patience, dignity, and quiet strength. Comments flooded every post. "She's a legend. This woman is proof that age is just a number. We all need to be like her, calm and humble." But while the world was discovering her story online, the real legacy was growing quietly at the shooting range. Rick was no longer the same man. Gone was the arrogance that once filled his voice and the pride that blinded his heart. In its place was something stronger, respect. Every morning he arrived early, long before the others, setting up the lanes and cleaning the equipment just as Margaret had done. He had started teaching newcomers, sharing the wisdom she left behind. When people asked him about his change, he always smiled and said, "Because I met someone who reminded me that a steady heart shoots straighter than steady hands." Tom, the range officer, noticed the change in everyone. The laughter that once mocked now encouraged. The pride that once divided now inspired. The old wooden board at the front of the range, where they listed high scores, had a new name carved at the top, the Hale Precision Cup. They decided to create it in her honor, an annual shooting event not for trophies or fame, but to celebrate humility, discipline, and grace. The rules were simple: no boasting, no competition trash talk, only focus, patience, and respect. And at the bottom of every event poster, printed in bold letters, was Margaret's quote, "Skill doesn't age, it just becomes quieter." One crisp morning, several weeks after the first event, Rick was at the range helping a teenage girl learn to aim. She was nervous, her hands shaking. "It's okay," he said gently. "Take your time. Don't rush the shot. Feel the stillness before you pull the trigger." The girl nodded, breathing deeply. The rifle cracked and the bullet hit near the center. She smiled wide, her eyes bright with pride. Rick chuckled softly. "Good job," he said. "You're already better than I was when I started." As they continued practicing, the door opened again. This time it was Tom carrying a small package. "Rick," he called out, "this came for you." Rick wiped his hands and opened it. Inside was a simple letter and a polished bullet casing. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the handwriting. It was Margaret's. He unfolded the letter carefully. The paper smelled faintly of tea and old books. "Dear Rick, I wanted to thank you for listening, truly listening. Most people only watch, but few understand. You did. I may not visit the range often anymore, but I watch from afar, in spirit if not in presence. Remember, every shot you take tells a story about your focus, not your strength. Teach others that, pass it on. And one day when someone mocks you or doubts you, smile quietly, because silence will always be the sharpest reply. Keep your aim true and your heart steady. Margaret Hale." Rick stared at the letter for a long time, his throat tight with emotion. He ran his thumb over the engraved bullet casing. On it were 3 simple words: patience, purpose, peace. He smiled, his eyes glistening. "You're still teaching me, old lady," he whispered. Word of her letter spread among the members of the range, and soon it was framed and hung near the front desk beside her photo, the one where she stood in her uniform, smiling faintly under the brim of her cap. Beneath it was a small plaque that read, "Margaret Hale, the woman who aimed with her heart." Years later, the Hale Precision Cup became one of the most respected local tournaments in the country. People came from miles away to compete, not for fame, but to feel the spirit of Margaret's story. Her values shaped not just a shooting competition, but a mindset: calmness over pride, mastery over ego, silence over noise. Rick continued to teach for many years, always ending his lessons with the same words. The target isn't your enemy. It's your mirror. It shows who you are when you're still. And in his home, on a small wooden shelf by the window, sat the letter, the bullet casing, and a photo of him and Margaret, taken the last time she visited. In it, she was smiling quietly, her hand on his shoulder, the rifle case leaning by her side. Sometimes he would sit by the window at sunset, reading her words again and again. The world had changed, but her message hadn't. True greatness, he had learned, wasn't in being seen. It was in being remembered for how you made others see themselves. Some legends live in books, others in history. But a rare few, like Margaret Hale, live forever in the hearts of those they humble.